right after she died, her name stayed alive because people remember her presence on the streets in downtown Denver and her service to other people.
A lot of times the everyday life of people, no matter what color their skin was, it's overlooked. And unfortunately for non-white people, I think even more so.
Whatever was deep down in my mom when she got there, there was nothing that was going to get in her way to keep her from, accomplishing her dream.
We haven't always got it right when it comes to treating marginalized groups.
Whether she's a saint or not, we know she's in heaven.
Are you familiar with the name Julia GREELEY? Honestly, I wasn't until I started researching this amazing Black woman who was a slave and is now on her way to sainthood. When telling Julia's story and other undertold stories about Black Coloradans' contributions to our state, I thought of my great-great-grandmother who was born into slavery. I also thought about the long fight for freedom that began centuries ago. It's a fight that my family in the South and Black Coloradans here devoted their lives to.
As a new Coloradan, there was a lot I wanted to learn about Black history in this great state. Growing up in the South, I know a lot of key events in my home region that shaped the entire country. Little Rock 9, the Greensboro sit-in, the Montgomery bus boycott, and I was excited to find out more about what took place here in Colorado to pave way for a better future. And I've learned there's no shortage of influential Black Coloradans, past and present, that have created a better future for people of all colors, because Black history is American history.
Over the next 30 minutes, we're taking you on a journey through our sometimes emotional storytelling process.
As we take you inside these stories on Coloradans that have shaped Black history and those who are carrying the torch into the future.
But first, we take a look at the past. When thinking of the word saint, she may not be who immediately comes to mind. But this Black History Month, 100 years after serving Denver's poor, former slave Julia GREELEY is one step closer to sainthood.
Julia GREELEY was enslaved in Hannibal, Missouri. At the time that she was enslaved, she lost her right eye from a slave master that was beating her mom.
Mary Leisring, the president and director of the Julia GREELEY Guild, says Julia was freed by the Missouri Emancipation Proclamation.
She came to Colorado and worked with Mrs. Gilpin, who was the wife of our first territorial governor.
Mrs. Gilpin was Catholic, and eventually Julia converted to Catholicism. Around that same time, she began taking to the streets of Denver, helping the homeless and those in need.
She would usually make $10 to $12 a month, but she always gave that away. And then if she didn't have money to buy things, like I said, she would beg for things. She never wanted to embarrass anyone, so she would give those goods at night. And she would usually have someone go and knock on the door and then hide, so she would make sure that the people would get the gifts.
Julia was known for giving clothes and food, baby carriages to expectant mothers, and she once carried a mattress on her back to give to someone who needed a bed. And so she became known as Denver's Angel of Charity. Julia passed away in 1917, and 100 years after her death, the second part of Julia's story begins.
What we have here really is not only Julia's earthly remains in the sarcophagus, but inside the sarcophagus is a funerary box.
After initially being buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery, Father Ron Catani, the pastor of the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, says she was moved to his church and is the first person to be buried here.
So right after she died, her name stayed alive because people remember her presence on the streets in downtown Denver and her service to other people. And so as that interest grew, it came to the attention of the church, and then the church started to move forward for her cause for sainthood.
The process began in 2016, and the Archdiocese of Denver recently received word that she passed the initial step in the process and is now officially considered a servant of God.
Several thousand pages of documents were submitted to the Vatican. And their job is to go through those and to see if this is, first of all, someone who lived a life of virtue, and then second of all, lived an exemplary life that needs to be elevated.
Now that those papers have been accepted, there are still several steps in the process. But Catani says through the process, more people are learning about Julia.
Because whether she's a saint or not, we know she's in heaven. We know that she's looking at the face of God every day.
By the way, there are no Black American saints. So if Julia Greeley completes the entire process, which I warn you is long, and receives final approval, she would be the first Black saint from the United States.
Miss Greeley was clearly a remarkable woman, and when I was reading more about her, I think something that speaks to her character most is that after she died, she lied in state as a lay Catholic, while hundreds of people visited her body to not only say their final goodbye, but to pay their respects to a woman whose life was devoted to others.
Something that often gets lost in our business, powerful stories like these aren't just impactful for the reporter telling them, but also for the photojournalists who bring them to life. We want to bring in photographer Dominic Lee, whose camera work is behind Julia Greeley's story and so many of our Black History Month stories.
Okay, Dom, you and I have worked on so many different Black History Month stories together. This year, Julia Greeley comes to mind. I want to ask you something. When I was talking to Father Catani for this story, I only asked him one question, and he was amazing. But what did you think about that? Me just asking the one question, and we got that like 20 minutes worth of interview.
I thought immediately this was a story bigger than what we knew, right? I mean, we had an idea about the story, but once Father Catani really opened up, it was like, wow, this is a way bigger than I could have imagined. And great storyteller. I really did feel like we were onto something a lot bigger than what we originally thought. And the details just kept coming, right? There's just more and more information that we discovered as he told us those details. So I was a bit surprised, but at the same time, I do also appreciate an interview like that as well.
Me too. It was kind of unconventional, but I felt good when I looked at you and you were like, I think we got it. I just asked one question. Before I have to let you go, I wanted to know, I know just like as a Black woman, there are many times where I get emotional when we work on these stories. And I was wondering just, you know, with you as a Black man, were there times where you get emotional working on these stories?
Yeah. The emotional connection for me is usually it comes from the discovery and not knowing the icons of our past because of their race. It strikes an emotional chord for me to know that we as a people have not been recognized for many of our accomplishments. So for me, the feeling was, wow, how many more other stories are like this that haven't been told? And that's the curiosity that I think Denver7 has going forward with our Black History Month coverage, is that we're here to discover the untold stories, the stories that represent our history truly. And that's where that emotional connection comes from. For me, is just the awe of realizing that many of our Black community stories have not been told. And that's what we're going to do.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking time for us, Dom. I always love to hear from you, and I love when our viewers can hear from you too, because you do so much work behind the scenes to make it all happen. So thank you.
There's never been a brighter spotlight on our healthcare workers than there has been in the last year amid the coronavirus pandemic. After the break, we shine that light on Black medical professionals continuing the fight for healthcare in Colorado's underserved communities.
Plus, breaking the color barrier, we sit down with the son of CU Nursing's first Black graduate.
Welcome back to a Denver7 special presentation honoring Black history. Emergency medicine has played a key role during the COVID-19 pandemic, as the doctors who specialize in it have often been tasked with buying time for those battling the most severe cases of COVID-19. I spoke with an emergency medicine physician at UC Health who's trying to not only save lives, but also encourage prevention.
Hey, we got a STEMI here. I need a room for it. Can we get
In the emergency department, questions require quick answers.
Can we take them to 17?
I think that's a great idea.
And Dr. Jacqueline Ward-Gaines thrives in the speed.
I like controlling chaos. And so when people come in and they're sick and they're hurting, their most vulnerable time, it can be pretty hectic. And that's when I like to step in.
And during a pandemic, she steps in a lot, especially for some of the most severe COVID-19 patients that are rushed to the ED.
And I just want to be there and provide the care for these patients during this time, and knowing that the fears, we have to protect ourselves, trying to protect others around us and our staff.
As Ward-Gaines works to keep herself and her colleagues safe, she's also working to encourage the Black and Latinx community. According to the latest state data, COVID-19 cases among Hispanics is almost 28%, although the Hispanic community is only 22% of Colorado's population. The Black community comprises only 4% of the state population, but accounts for just over 3% of the state's deaths.
I've talked to pharmacy and we're going to cover him.
Ward-Gaines says the numbers give her and other healthcare providers a responsibility to encourage vaccination, a topic that brings hesitation for some communities of color who cite historic events like the Tuskegee syphilis study or the life of Henrietta Lacks.
We haven't always got it right when it comes to treating marginalized groups, but we're trying, and this vaccine is a way. So when you see that there's a mass vaccination, go get it. We're trying, and hopefully one day we will get better, and those disparities will be diminished.
And she's doing her part by not only helping patients, but also helping to diversify the curriculum she teaches to residents.
I started a diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum for our emergency residents. That's on rollout this month. We're just really jumping on board with digging into the literature and everything to try to decrease health disparities in marginalized groups.
These are big goals, but Ward-Gaines says,
I feel that I stand on the shoulders of giants.
So she'll never stop achieving.
Now to a woman who paved the way for Black Coloradans in the medical field. Zipporah Parks Hammond was the first Black graduate of the University of Colorado's nursing school and any school in Colorado in 1946. Her trailblazing years in CU's program came, of course, in a segregated society and during World War II. We spoke to one of her two sons who said his mother not only had a unique resolve to overcome those obstacles, but felt it was her mission from an early age.
Zipporah, as a teenager, probably in the mid-30s, actually wrote essays that talked about how to improve the situation of the Negro in society. She could see in the Denver community the challenges and the segregation and the separation of races.
Parks Hammond's nursing career was cut short by a 2-year battle with tuberculosis, but from that came an opportunity. She would break a second color barrier, becoming Denver's first person of color to serve as director of medical records. She also met her husband, Sheldon, during tuberculosis treatment. You can watch our full interview right now on Denver7 or your favorite streaming device.
To another essential worker in Colorado's Black community today. And this story, it starts an ocean away, where an East African girl had a dream that would lead her here to Colorado. Now she's grown and a pharmacist. Her goal, it goes beyond filling prescriptions. Each refill gives patients their medicine while also giving Mary Desta her purpose.
It is fulfilling for me to do what I do.
Desta, a pharmacist, just opened Apex Pharmacy in Aurora 3 months ago. After having worked for nearly 10 years in a drugstore chain, it was time for something new.
I wanted to get involved in the community, impact more lives, not just fill prescriptions, but do clinical services that pharmacists are able to do.
Desta says during a pandemic,
Pharmacy Mary, how may I help you?
Pharmacists have received lots of questions.
We are the most accessible healthcare professionals. We are either a call or a walk-in away.
And speaking of accessibility, when Desta was deciding where to open her pharmacy, she chose Aurora, an area known for its growing communities of color, communities that have faced disproportionate outcomes with COVID-19. So Desta wants to
advocate, educate, and empower.
And those are tasks she's glad to do. After all, people fought for her too, including civil rights leaders.
I, as a Black woman and as an immigrant, I'm able to reap the benefits of that.
and her mother, who immigrated from East Africa to the United States and later petitioned for Desta and her brother.
I escaped, fled to Sudan, 19-hour walk, and then made it to the U.S.
The grueling journey allowed Desta to avoid Eritrea's mandatory military service for men and women. The country has been criticized for forcing its citizens into indefinite military service.
It was not the life I envisioned for myself.
But the life she has now, a college graduate, a healthcare professional with her own business, it's what Desta has always wanted.
I'm happy to be where I am. It is the land of opportunity, right?
And now she has the opportunity to serve others.
She definitely knows what she's doing, and she cares about the people in her community.
Desta cares so much about her community, she made it a theme on one of her pharmacy walls.
A local student did that for us. Connected faces, showing we grow and bloom together when we're connected.
To truly understand the significance of the civil rights movement, you have to go back to the beginning. And that beginning arrived in Colorado a century earlier than the national movement. We go back to the 1860s after the break. Welcome back. When we talk about civil rights in our country, your mind may automatically go to scenes from the 1960s. But in Colorado, a civil rights movement started nearly 100 years earlier.
Civil rights in Colorado goes back to the 1860s.
It's little known history, but author Adrian Miller says during that time a group of 100 black men sent a petition to the governor and other state leaders demanding black men receive the right to vote as soon as Colorado became a state.
That really held up the process and delayed statehood for Colorado. Now, part of it was because white men who were eligible to vote had objections to statehood for other reasons, but that was certainly part of the mix. And that actual petition did not fall on deaf ears, so people discussed that. And eventually, African-American men did get the right to vote when Colorado became a state in 1876.
Women would not receive that same right until 1893, but that's still almost 3 decades before the 19th Amendment gave all American women the right to vote. 1895 brought another civil rights victory for black Coloradans.
Our General Assembly actually passed a civil rights law. That's what it was called at the time. And essentially it just said people of color could not be barred from any kind of public accommodations.
Representative Joseph H. Stewart was behind the legislation. He was born in Barbados, but made his way to Colorado as an attorney and really pushed for the bill.
He was able to get the bill through the legislature without any opposition. Now, I do have to qualify that without any opposition part because there were some people who were staunchly against this bill, but they decided to abstain.
The bill became Colorado law in 1895, but due to racism, it was never truly enforced.
A lot of times when there's landmark legislation or things that are passed to help the plight of African Americans, usually they don't have enough enforcement to really make a difference, and that was the case here.
But the biggest blow to Colorado's civil rights law came from the federal government.
It's just about a year after this law passed, the United States Supreme Court passed Plessy v. Ferguson, which sanctioned racial segregation, or otherwise known as Jim Crow.
I'm not surprised to hear that we fought for those rights, but then they were not implemented in a way that was exactly what was intended.
But Colorado State Representative Leslie Harrod says she's also not surprised that the law was passed.
Colorado has really led the way on some of these issues. And, you know, while we are still very late on a lot of issues, and we were late to allow women the right to vote, I mean, that should have been around since statehood, of course. But the people of Colorado have a tendency to stand up, fight for their rights, and create real change.
And that fight never went away.
The movement for Black lives has been happening for generations, right? It didn't just pop up this summer.
Harrod says Colorado's state motto means nothing without providence or nothing without God, a way to describe how early Coloradans found the strength to start the fight and how today Coloradans of color continue it.
Every day we lose a piece of our state's history, whether it be a building of historical significance that's demolished or a person with a connection to a major event of the past. The clock is ticking to preserve our stories, and that's where the Colorado Historical Foundation comes in. They're on a mission to capture Black American stories and connect them to places where they happened, especially during the segregation era.
We received 3 grants from the History Colorado State Historical Fund to kind of fill in some gaps for underrepresented communities' history in Colorado. We didn't have a solid documentation of where all those sites existed. So we have found over 270 sites in Colorado that took it upon themselves to list themselves in the Green Books as safe places, peaceable places where Black men and women could stay.
Among those sites, places like the Shorter Community AME Church, a former spiritual safe haven for Black Coloradans that has been revived as a theater, or 1514 Blake Street, what used to be the People's Restaurant, started by an escaped slave turned Colorado businessman, Barney Ford, and Lincoln Hills, which was one of the few places that housed Black travelers and is now a camp for kids from marginalized communities.
There was a time when Black Coloradans were not only banned from businesses, but were banned from entire cities. Throughout the early 1900s, thousands of towns throughout America prohibited Black people from becoming residents. They're called sundown towns, and hardly any are in the South. Most are right here in the West, in the Midwest, and all across the North. In Colorado, Terry Gentry, a volunteer for the Black American West Museum, told me several cities, including Loveland, Cherry Hills Village, Louisville, and Golden, were all considered sundown towns.
We don't necessarily have a complete record of all the sundown towns in Colorado. There are a few that posted banners or posted signs to make sure that people knew.
While most Colorado towns no longer recognize the racist practice, sociologist James Lowen, who has researched sundown towns all across the country, says we still feel the implications of them today.
Second generation sundown town issues, for example, an overwhelmingly white police force, overwhelmingly white teaching staff that doesn't have much of an interracial curriculum to teach either.
You can learn more about Lowen's research and the history of sundown towns in our state on our website, thedenverchannel.com.
After the break, a story that's sure to make you smile. How a Denver police officer's daily route is connecting him not only to the community, but also to his roots. A big part of the conversation on race relations in Colorado and across America is policing. The connection between law enforcement and their community has been under the microscope. The Denver officer you're about to meet is trying to forge that connection on two wheels.
Each pedal leads to a different area and a different conversation.
How you doing, sir?
That's why pedaling is Officer Wallace Sam's favorite way to get around.
When you're on the street level, you are the very first initial contact with these people.
And people are a big part of why Officer Sam wanted to become a police officer.
Don't think you get as much of a melting pot as you do anywhere else except Denver.
That variety, one that Sam was born into.
I was born and raised here in the Montbello area.
And one that keeps him on his toes.
Have a good day.
As he interacts with the community.
Especially downtown. I mean, you'll have a unique homeless population. In the same area, you have a unique business population. And one issue here is a different issue there. I think it's very important as a police officer to be able to, be here when you need to and then come down here when you need to.
It's a balance that he finds when looking at the lives of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. and the first Black NYPD officer, Samuel Battle.
He went to that grassroots effort of talking to the community. So when we talk about relating to the community, I think he is probably the first and one of the best examples of that.
And now Officer Sam gets to be an example of his own with each pedal, connecting him to the community.
All right, have a good day, sir.
And the place he calls home.
The bicycle helps that for sure.
So great to see Officer Sam connecting with everyone on the streets.
It really is, and we hope that you felt connected with Black history here in Colorado through these stories. We want to thank you for being with us.
For all of this month's stories celebrating Black Coloradans, go to thedenverchannel.com/Black History Month. Have a wonderful day.